This is Chadd Huizenga. Like Evan Tinklenberg, just a couple of weeks ago, Chadd is another peer of mine from Trinity Christian College, sang in the choir together,
Yes, we
did
did.
outcry together. Chadd, I talked about Evan's outcry audition, but am I right in remembering that you you didn't audition right away? Did you audition maybe a couple
I
years in?
no, I think what happened is I auditioned right away. I stopped doing Outcry,
Got it.
not that like halfway through
Okay,
college
I
because
remember there being a change in there.
yeah, and I don't really remember why. I think it was one of those things where it's just like, I'm definitely one of those people who it's like I'm a more of a listener of music than I am like a an actual like player. So I
Hey,
think
here's
part of
one.
yeah.
We played together to open for Judah and the Lion before they were a thing.
That is one thing that I will still tell people to this day about my college experience that I like this like my big claim to fame is that like
Yeah.
I like one opened for Judah and the Lion, two was part of like booking them at Trinity. And I think
Oh,
within
really?
like a year they were on Letterman. So I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
like
They were
it's like
nobodies. Like they ate in the cafeteria with us, and then we
mm,
like played frisbee,
yep,
and then all of
yep.
a sudden they were on the radio.
It's awesome. That's like I'm still like so proud of myself for that one.
Yeah, we did. It was like a little cover band thing that you could audition for, and we put together. Evan might have been a part of that actually. Now that I think about it,
I think he may
I think
have.
he was.
I don't. Yeah. Wow. Look at us.
Wow.
That's all of us here are us trolls in Classis
We'll
Wisconsin. Gotta
we'll
love
call
it.
Judah and the Lion and see. Actually, the lead singer has a little worship group now, just called
Yeah.
Judah. That's pretty cool. I don't know too much about the theology, but so that's
Nice.
a
I'll check it
recommendation on
out.
the front end. Chadd, introduce yourself to Classis Wisconsin.
Yeah. My name's Chadd Huizenga. I am currently serving as a pediatric chaplain down here in Milwaukee. I am formally, it's official now after this last classes meeting, a member of City Reformed Church here in Milwaukee, called by them to do the work of being a chaplain. Um, didn't grow up here in Wisconsin. I have a lot of family in Sheboygan though, so it's not it's not an unknown place for me. But I grew up in Northwest Indiana, grew up in the CRC, went to Trinity, went to Calvin Sem, and then after that I served for a number of years, for about 3 years, as the associate pastor at Park Lane Christian Reformed Church in Portland, Oregon. So a little bit different from the Midwest.
Chadd,
And
what
then,
talk about
yeah,
that your call to seminary? Like,
yeah,
what were some of your interests and giftings that made that a norm, like a natural leap right into
for
seminary?
sure. So for me, it's a kind of a longer story. I grew up in a very committed CRC family. Like, we went to church twice on Sundays, which, every Sunday. And it was something that always in my family, there was always the kind of like, hey, maybe Chadd would be like, this is something Chadd would be good for. Like, a lot of my family, a lot of people in my life saw those gifts early on. I didn't like outright reject it, but it was kind of like, it's the back of my mind as I went to college. I wanted to originally be a history teacher, but I
Mm.
remember a time in church growing up that my pastor after catechism class was like, hey, consider studying like Bible and theology. Like, I know history, that's great. You want to be a teacher, that's great too, but consider this as well. And so it was in the back of my head going to college. And for me, as I started studying theology more, I really was like, I really like this. I was really passionate about learning more about God and church and really like serving the church. I always felt in my own personal life the most, like affirmed as who I was as a person in the church,
Mm.
and really kind of felt like some of the deepest relationships I had. And I really enjoyed that about it. So in college, but I guess the thing is, I always had a difficult time seeing myself like up front, like doing the normal pastor thing. It kind of was like, is this the right fit for what I wanted to do? And so, but like with the encouragement, a lot of like my professors at Trinity, they were like, you know what, go to seminary. Like, if you want to do something else, if you want to go off to more academic stuff, like you can. Getting an MDiv, getting your seminary degree is a good first step. So just do that first. So for me, because I did study theology at Trinity, I really was able to focus a lot on trying out different like ministry things
Mm.
in seminary. I
Mm.
really could focus volunteering at my church. And during that, I had the opportunity to serve for as an internship at Pine Rest Mental Health Hospital as a chaplain. and I saw a world of ministry that I had never knew about before. And I did that internship partly because I remember going into Trinity, or sorry, I remember going into Calvin being like, I'm a pretty heady person. I need to like work on my pastoral care skills. And when I went to the mental hospital, working with, like paranoid schizophrenics and people with like bipolar and stuff like that, connecting with them in a way that was like you couldn't really connect intellectually because people, they're going through, like, they're struggling with delusions and other stuff. And so me opening up this area of my life that maybe that I didn't really know I had, the like emotional side of things, something that I always was didn't always feel super like, affirmed in our kind of historic like intellectual reform tradition, as like, no, this is a good thing, and it's something that for me I'm actually pretty good at
Mm.
naturally and I have
Mm.
skills for. So for me, the calling into ministry has always been kind of like a, well, let's try this out and we'll go from there kind of thing, and everything kind of opened up along the way. And even when I went off to Portland to do more like, traditional church ministry, there was still that kind of in the back of my mind, chaplaincy, what about that? Like, maybe it wasn't the right time, but how about now? This kind of thing.
So
So for me, that calling has always been like just the next step.
yeah, so you had that experience, that chaplaincy experience, but then you leave it for a little while and talk about your experience in the pastorate in different contexts.
Yeah, so for me, I actually did apply for a chaplaincy job at Pine Rest again.
Mm.
When I was done, and I didn't get that. And I was a little bummed because I really thought that was kind of what God was calling me to. So for me, it was kind of like what is it? And so then, at the end of seminary, I had applied for a number of churches, and the one in Portland, Oregon was the only one that offered me a call.
Mm.
It was for an associate pastor job, which was, a glorified youth pastor job. And I was like, this is not what I see myself doing, God. Like, what's the joke here? You know what I mean? But, visiting the church, checking them out, I was like, no, I really think this is where God is calling me to. And we had it was a good experience. I like learned a lot about myself, learned about a lot about working at a church in a place like as an associate pastor, right? I think there is some opportunities there for more growth that I needed as a person and as a pastor that I wouldn't have gotten necessarily
Mm.
if I would have. I certainly wouldn't have gotten necessarily if I jumped right into chaplaincy or if I would have jumped right into a lead pastor position. So for me, it was a really good opportunity to kind of learn more about ministry as I'm like entering into ministry. But worked with a lot of youth while I was there, did a lot of youth ministry, did a lot of children's ministry. And for me, that's kind of the way that I saw God at work in that time.
Mm.
One of the main ways. I went in not really knowing like, what am I doing here? I don't really like youth ministry, don't really feel called to it. But I really, during that time, we were able to do a couple things. We were in a neighborhood in Portland where a lot of younger families were moving in. And so we kind of identified we need to do some things to really reach the young families.
Mm.
And so we did a lot of ministry focused on young families, especially with young children. And I got to do so. We actually they still had an evening service. We did one of our evening services a month. We turned it into a like worship service specifically designed for families with young children.
Cool.
It's called Messy Church. It's a program. People can look it up. And I was able to kind of like lead that, and I really kind of like develop, like once again, kind of through that experience, seeing, oh, not only am I pretty good, I'm like pretty good at working with kids. I really like doing it
Mm.
too.
Yeah.
And that's kind of for me, like noticing that in myself, that I have this heart and this like, passion for like working with children specifically, not like youth. So like basically like younger than middle school, right? Like that was for me what was like what I am really passionate about, and kind of seeing that. And then when God kind of prompted me to start discerning what's next, kind of seeing with like some friends and family that, oh, chaplaincy is the thing, but actually pediatric chaplaincy
Mm.
is the thing, because
Mm.
that's where your like gifts I've given you are.
Yeah. So you mentioned you're a lifelong CRC guy, as am I.
Mm-hmm.
And in talking, you just said like, kind of in chaplaincy, kind of learning to affirm some of the, empathy, emotional care, type of things that goes into living out following Jesus. How, like, what would you say to the average CRC church on that topic? Like, what do we
Yeah,
need to hear? Because I think like, I would agree, at least in my context, like, we are typically intellectual, critical, and I mean critical in the positive sense of the word,
for sure.
people. What could the rest of us learn, from your experiences on the other side?
Oftentimes, when I hear it from like not even just CRC, right? I think this is true actually of a lot of Christian denominations from kind of my working in chaplaincy. One of the cool things is I get to exposure of a lot of Christian traditions, so I can talk with some of my colleagues about it. So it's not just CRC. I think it is kind of like generally. I think it's kind of like a unique thing of like that Reformed tradition, depending on the like all those denominations.
Like
But
broadly reformed, like Presbyterian,
I would say so. Yeah, I think
stretched out.
pretty. It's not just a CRC thing, I would say, right?
Okay.
It's like I would say if you identify as Reformed, you're probably going to come with this idea that like, oh yeah, we're the smart ones. We think through the things logically, like emotions, right? And to me, what I always like,
I know a lot
and
of
people
Baptists who are like that too. So
exactly,
yeah,
exactly,
fair
and
enough.
and oftentimes they would also like identify as Reformed then too. So
Sure, sure,
it's like
sure.
okay, yeah, and that's and to me, what I always want to tell people in those situations is I always say, you know, there's a couple things I always talk about. It's like because there's this idea that like emotions are bad.
Yeah.
Don't use your emotions. And I'm like, well, okay, first we gotta look to John. We gotta see that Jesus, he is weeping over his friend Lazarus dying. Like if Jesus had emotions, Jesus is perfect. Emotions are not
Yeah.
bad, they are good. And even weeping, a very hard, maybe negative. I don't like it's I would say weeping is actually quite helpful in certain situations. So it's not a negative emotion, but like Jesus had emotions.
Yeah.
So it's pretty clear these are not bad. These are good things. These are given to us by God for like good things. So that's the first thing I would say to remind ourselves. No, no, no. Emotions are not bad. But then when we're thinking about how do we make it, because it's always around decision making and like worship. But like I'm going to focus on the decision making part. Like, okay, if I'm making a good example for me, when I took the church in Portland, Oregon, right? Portland, Oregon was 2,000 miles away from any friends and family I had. Didn't know anyone, moving to a city I've never been to. And I was so stressed out about that decision. I remember a person in my church, she came up to me and she's like, "Oh, have you lost weight?" I was like, "Yeah, I had lost like 10 pounds, stressing out, like, is this the
Mm,
right move?
mm,
Like, leaving all of my community, all the people I love, all this stuff." And like emotionally, I was like a mess. I was very stressed out, very anxious, very scared of that decision. But to me, I knew that about myself and I could use that as information,
sure.
but not the main decision making. And to me, what it comes to about using emotions, it's not, we always use our emotions as the thing that helps us make that decision,
Mm.
right? So, like, if the emotion's the only driver, that's a bad thing. Sometimes I made a joke one time. I said, like, if I'm being chased by a bear, emotions are gonna play into my decision making. It's just gonna happen
Yeah.
because emotions will always. But to me, it's all about being emotionally healthy people. And I think for us, Calvinist people, right? I always think about what John Calvin wrote about, like what like true wisdom consists entirely in two parts, right? Knowledge of God and knowledge of ourselves. And I think now, Calvin, there's probably a number of ways you can go with that. For me personally, what I take that as is I need like it's multi-layered. Like we need to learn about people, more human subjects like psychology and stuff. But for me, if I take that in a personal route, I need to be an emotionally healthy person. I need to grow, learn more about myself. Maybe that means some therapy. Maybe that means some other stuff in my life. But know who I am so that when I'm making those big decisions in life, whether I'm serving at church, whatever it is, whether I'm making a move, I can know that I'm healthy and that when I'm having those emotions, I can use them as the information they are, not the ultimate thing that is like driving that decision, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Why do you think it is that we have such a negative reaction to being emotional? Like, is it a total depravity thing? Is it a Gnostic thing? Like,
I
what
yeah.
is it about like a
I
broadly reformed tradition that is so worried about being emotional?
It's not something I've actually like really looked into deeply, and I think that'd be a super interesting topic to like look into more. I wonder, my first thought was, I wonder if it's a kind of a backlash against kind of like Pentecostal
Mm,
charismatic movements, which,
mm.
I'm not making a judgment about
No, yeah.
charismatic movements necessarily. I have actually a lot of CRC pastor friends who would identify as charismatic, who I have a deep respect for.
Charismatic
Um,
Calvinists, we call ourselves.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So I think to me it's one of those things where I would say that it's kind of some of that as kind of a way of like
Mm,
putting ourselves back from some of those other traditions. And not even those, maybe some more like low church, less historically intellectual, like
mm,
because the history of the CRC, kind of that reformed Calvinist theology, right, does really come from like Calvin was kind of that one of the like kind of the great theologian of the Reformation, like the first theologian to
yeah.
really like write it down in a more academic way. And so I think like there's some of that as well.
Mm,
And I also like honestly, I think part of it too is just like at least the CRC as a denomination. Like if we're gonna get really nitty gritty, like with our like historic Dutch connection, it's historically pretty blue collar.
mm,
Not the type of people who are going to be like the most self-reflective all the time and who are really going to like stop and consider
yeah.
their emotions.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of reasons and some good reasons for that, right?
Yeah.
Like 100 years ago, like life was tough. You had to just be a little tougher. So
Yeah. I have a lot of responses. I mean, that's an interesting topic for me. One is,
yeah.
Pastor Chris from City Reformed Church, where Chadd is, has encouraged our classes for a couple years now to be talking about body theology, and
Mhm.
we've been looping that in at Oostburg here, just because there is such a, and whether it's a kind of leftover from Gnosticism, dualism that the church has struggled with forever, that we just
Mhm.
have this sense that like physical stuff is bad and lower, and we just want to be spiritual, intellectual, uh, and so
Mhm.
that's got to be a major part of it, I
I
think.
think
Where it's
so.
just like, hey, having an emotion is not necessarily like fleshly in the negative
Mhm.
sense, to use like the negative version of fleshly. It
Yep.
might just be a normal response you were created to have.
Well, and I think part of it too, right, is like, so in my work, I sit with a lot of grieving
Yeah.
families when a child has died. And it's one of those things where it's just like the emotions, like we have a lot of fun, like joyful emotions. Like it's great to be happy and like, spend time with friends and family and have a good time. But like when you're grieving, when like Jesus, you're weeping over a dead friend,
Mm.
a child, a sibling, whatever it is, like these are not enjoyable things, but we know scientifically, like it is good. Like this is good for you to weep. It's a way for us to process, to make, to mark the reality of like this terrible thing happened. We can't pretend like it's not terrible because it is. Like this is not the way things are supposed to be.
Yeah. Right.
And so having those emotions is something that we can do, and it's not fun, it's not enjoyable, but it is good for us.
Mm.
And now I want, I mean, like I also want to wrestle with, right, eventually all tears will be wiped away.
Mm.
So it's made like, I mean, like maybe it's not intrinsically good, they're a result of a fallen world,
Sure.
but it is a way that we can enter into that and kind of like grow and heal through some of these really hard things, process them in healthy ways. Like
Mm-hmm.
we have been given these tools by our creator, by God, so that, he wants us to be able to grow, to be healthy too, through these really hard things in life.
Yeah. Yeah. You want. I don't know if you'd agree with this. Maybe you would. You want. You want knowledge to inform emotion. If it just stays at knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's what people talk about that all the time. Oh, it's just you just have it in your head. You don't have it in your heart. I think that's kind of
Yeah.
what they're getting at. Like knowledge should inform emotion, and the other way around is the kind of stuff that we push back against, right?
Yeah.
Well, my emotion affects what I know.
it's
That would make me nervous. But just staying
it's
at knowledge and not moving into emotion makes me nervous too.
it definitely is. It's like it's one of those things where I remember when I was working at church, like we need to just be like healthy people.
Mm.
And part of that is being emotionally healthy. And part of that doesn't mean that I don't have like strong emotions in certain things that like, I remember sitting during council meetings at the church and I was like not happy about some things we were doing. And I have to remind myself like, this is my emotional reaction and I can't make decisions based
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah.
So it's not like, oh, I'm gonna have the right emotion in every situation.
Right.
No.
Right.
But I know that, okay, this is the reaction I'm having. This is overkill. And so I need to know that when I'm making that decision versus like, sometimes you do need to go with your gut. Something seems off here. I know myself, I'm a healthy person. Yeah, this feels right. So I'm going to use it. I am going to have that inform maybe more than I would in some other situation.
Mm. Yeah, that's a fascinating subject that Reformed people should talk about way more often. But in the interest of time, Chadd, anything else you've been working on or wanted to plug, or things happening at City Reformed Church or in your work that are worth sharing or talking about?
No, not really. I mean, for me, it's just kind of like that's one of the things I like about being a chaplain. Is I really do like you kind of respond to what comes in. There's not a lot of long-term planning of like working on stuff, which I really like. I like to just be able to like, okay, I'll just do this work and be with people. There's no rush necessarily. Just kind of be able to sit with them during the like difficult times in their life. Kind of keep reminding them that you may not be feeling it. Once again, that feeling right now during really hard times, you're not feeling necessarily that God's present, but He is. And myself, other friends and families that are with them, like we can be there to kind of be that like tangible presence that God is here with us during this place too.
Yep. Well, thanks for what you do, and it's a valuable vantage point for our denomination. But in the interest of this little program, the interest of our classes too, will benefit from your point of view. So thanks for your time this morning.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Appreciate it.